Hi there, I'm Rosie from Sew Over It, and today we're going to be sewing up a wrap skirt sewing pattern. So specifically, I'm going to be sewing up the wrap skirt from our Beginner's Guide to Sewing ebook. This is an ebook that we put together with a bunch of little projects that will really start off your sewing journey. So with the help of this ebook, you can sew up 6 projects. You will start off with a cushion cover, a tote bag, a drawstring bag, there's a toiletries bag with a zip in it, a wrap skirt that we're going to be sewing today, and also some really easy to fit pyjama bottoms. We're going to be covering sewing up the wrap skirt today, and I'm going to show you and talk you through all the processes so you can come away with a finished skirt. But first, I'm going to talk through some of the things you might think about before you start your sewing project. So I've got a set of instructions here. Whether you're a beginner sewer or not, it's always quite nice to have the instructions handy, because there might be some rules that the pattern company does or doesn't have, different seam allowances, different ways of doing things. So it's always handy, even if you think you know what you're doing, just to have those instructions to refer back to at any point. So I printed mine off here. All of ours are provided as digital files as well, so you can also look at them on your phone or your laptop if you've got that nearby, or a computer, or yeah, you can print them out like this. And the first thing I'm going to start off with doing is choosing a size. So with a wrap skirt, there is very, very little fitting, and that's why we've included it in this beginner's ebook. Just because I feel at this stage you don't want to worry about fitting too much. You just want to get on with your sewing journey first and come away with something you're happy wearing. So even though there's not much fitting or anything like that, you still have to choose a size to sew. And there's a couple of things you might want to think about. So the first thing you're going to do is measure yourself. So this is a skirt, so we only need to take our waist measurement and our hip measurement. I'd recommend doing that whilst you're standing up, not like me, sitting down. But when you have those measurements, you can look at the size chart to work out whereabouts you are. So I'm going to use my measurements as an example and talk you through how I choose the size in this particular pattern. So my waist is 35 inches, and in our Sew Over It body measurements chart, it puts me at between a 16 and an 18 on the 6 to 20 size range. So you might note that we've got 2 size ranges. We've got one which is 6 to 20, and then we've got a separate size range which is drafted to a slightly different shape, which is for sizes 18 to 30. So you can just pick the area of measurements which suits you best. So I've got my waist, which is 35 inches, which puts me between a 16 and 18. My hips proportionally are actually quite a lot smaller. They are 43, so they put me between a 14 and a 16. So already I don't fit into any of the sizes. That's absolutely fine. I think 99% of people are not in one straight size bracket. So you've just got to think, if you're maybe in between size brackets, how the garment that you're making fits you, how it closes, how you want it to fit you as well. Do you want it tight? Do you want it loose? With a wrap skirt, it's very flexible because you can tie it tight or you can tie it loose, but there is a limit to how small it can go. So what I'm going to look at next is the finish measurement. So the size of the skirt when it's sewn up, what that is going to be. So if I look down from 16, or 16 and 18 where my waist is, because that's the kind of most important measurement with this. The finished measurement of the waist at an 18 is 37 inches. So that's going to be 2 inches bigger than I am. And the finished measurement of the 16 is 35. So that is dead on my measurement. And I know from experience that wearing wrap skirts, I like them to be snug. I like them to give me a bit of a waist, and I kind of wear them with tight fitting tops, and that's the kind of look I like. So already I'm thinking I'm going to err on the smaller side, but you need to be thinking about that same sort of process, what you're going to wear it with, how you like wearing things. But particularly with wrap skirts, like I said, there's a limit to how small they can be, because you've got a gap where you pull a tie through, and that will only go so far. And at some point that will stop. You can't just keep pulling and pulling and pulling until it's really small. So there is a limit to how small it's going to be, and that is that waist measurement. So for the 16, for me, it would be 35 or 37 in the 18. But if my waist is a bit bigger at any point, if I've had a big lunch, it changes throughout the month. Everyone has sort of fluctuations in their body shape and size. With a wrap skirt, because it wraps fully over on both sides, actually If at some point I don't tie it at its tightest, that's absolutely fine. I'm still going to have a lot of skirt at the front. I'm still going to have full coverage. There's a lot of overlap. So actually for this pattern, I'm thinking erring on the smaller side will be better than erring on the bigger side. Always when you're sewing, you've got to think about these things. If you're making a t-shirt perhaps, and it's like a boxy fit, loose t-shirt, you could say, oh, actually, I don't want it as boxy. I'll go on the smaller size if you're between sizes, or you want to embrace the boxy look, that's great. Go on the bigger size. So just have a real think about what you like yourself. That is the joy of sewing. We're making this so it suits us how we want it to be. So for this example, I've chosen the 16 as my size. As I said, my hips kind of put me more in the 14 bracket, but it's a loose skirt. It's not particularly fitted once you get past the waist. I mean, it's not fitted at all really. So I would be tempted just to cut a straight 16 and not worry about my hips. Perhaps if your hips were going, I'd say 2 sizes bigger than your waist, so perhaps you were a 16 at the waist and a 20 at the hip, I'd be tempted to grade out to a 20 just to give yourself a little bit of room. But other than that, you really don't have to worry too much about the fitting. And always when you're thinking about choosing a size, make sure you take into account the finished garment measurements. We do get a lot of questions asking, is it true to size? Are our patterns true to size? And what they are true to is these finished measurements. These are literally the measurements that your garment will turn out to be if you follow all the seam allowances and all the sewing instructions correctly. So if we say you're a 12 in the shops, don't automatically say, oh, is it like a 12 in the shops? Because we all know all the shops have all the different sizes for a size 12. You can be a 12 in one and a 16 in another. What your true to size really is looking at these finished garment measurements and therefore knowing exactly how it's going to end up in comparison to your body measurement. So I hope that made sense. That is your size chart here. You've also got your fabric requirements, so you can see for a size 16 how much fabric you need. And then just to show you a little look through, you're going to get your lay plans, which are going to tell you how to cut out your pattern on your fabric. So in this example, you can see this is how all of Sewovit's lay plans are done. We've got pattern pieces on your fabric, whether the fabric is folded or whether it's laid out flat with 2 selvages right at the end of your fabric. And what's crucial to look at here is that one of the pattern pieces is in grey, and that means that it has been cut with the instructions facing down onto the fabric. And that just means that because it is cut on a flat piece of fabric, and we're cutting 2 of one pattern piece, so we're cutting 1 pair, we don't want 2 that are exactly the same, we want 1 that's a mirror image. So that's why we cut 1 up and 1 down. If you're putting something on the fold, that doesn't matter because you're automatically getting that mirror image. So just keep an eye out for those grey pattern pieces. There's a few dotted about, and it is usually if you're cutting something on the flat, so on 1 layer of fabric rather than 2. You'll have all your instructions for cutting out there and on the different widths of fabric as well. And then we'll start working through our instructions as well. So for our patterns, the majority of our patterns, we have illustrated instructions. There are a few of our older patterns which still have photographs, but they are being changed. We're working through that job. But for a long time, we've been doing fully illustrated instructions like this. So hopefully you can see they're really nice and clear and easy to follow. And in some of our newer instructions as well, we also have links in our booklets. So if you're looking at them on your phone or on your laptop, you can click on one of the links and it'll take you to a relevant tutorial for that section as well. So that's the instructions. That's choosing your size. Thinking about choosing fabrics, I'm using this really lovely viscose. It's coming into summer right now whilst I'm filming this, and I think that this will be gorgeous with like a white t-shirt and trainers, and it's going to be so floaty and nice to wear. It makes me think a bit of holidays. So viscose is perfect. If you are more cautious, then a cotton lawn will work as well, because that's kind of nice. It's still going to have the floatiness, but it's going to be a little less fiddly to sew. This won't be hard, but you can see it's kind of floaty. It might move around a little bit. A cotton lawn just has a little bit more stability in it. And you can also use crepes as well, polyester crepes. They kind of get a bad rep because obviously they're polyester, they're man-made, but if they are in a skirt in particular, they're not against your skin so much, they're not quite as warm, and you can get some absolutely gorgeous prints in them as well. So don't be too worried about that. And also they are very, very reasonable in price. So if you're just starting out and you maybe want to experiment a bit, there's nothing wrong with trying a polyester or crepe. So those are the three that I would definitely recommend. So you can go and choose some fabric, go and choose your size, and then we'll start sewing. So the first thing we are going to do is sew our side seams. So I have got my back skirt here, which I cut on the fold. So I can open that out like that. And then I've got two front skirts here. And I need to identify which edge is the side seam and which edge is not, is the part that wraps over. So we know on the back side seam that we have some notches. So you always want to cut into the, make sure before you take your pattern pieces off that you cut your notches, because they will be really, really useful in helping you assemble your skirt or whatever you're making. So I am looking for, there's a notch. Looking for the notches. So one side is notched, that's the side seam. The side without any notches, that is the part that wraps over, that's the front. So I know, placing right sides together, that these are both the side seam. And I'm just going to pin at the notches first, and then I'll pin the rest of the seam. And so we have notches for a couple of reasons really. For, like I just mentioned, for identifying what seam is what. Different seams will have different notches in different places. They help us identify the front and the back of a garment as well. For example, when you're putting in a sleeve, you might see that the front of the sleeve has one notch, the back of the sleeve has two notches. And usually if you've got a centre back seam, that'll have at least two notches, maybe even three. So you tend to get more notches the further around the body you go. So it's helpful in that case, and in the case of identification. They're also very, very helpful for if you have got a very long seam, and rather than just matching the top and bottom of the seam and then being left to your own devices in the middle, those notches, kind of like this actually, will just really help you get your pins in first and get your pieces of fabric aligned really nicely. And then the third reason you probably won't come across in the wrap skirt, but you might in trickier garments, is that perhaps you might have a particularly curved seam, and quite often in that case you would have one piece of fabric that's curved like this, convex, and then one piece of fabric that's curved concave, and when you lay them on top of each other they don't look like they want to fit together. And having those notches, the pattern maker is telling you exactly where they're supposed to fit together, and if you follow those instructions they will fit together nicely. So they are also a bit of help from the pattern maker for how to pin seams together and sew them together. So notches are of high importance. And yeah, so this is all pinned. I'm going to get rid of my other front for the moment, and then I'm just going to sew the seam. So I just got polyester thread here. It is the best of all the threads really. You might think that cotton thread would be nicer or fancier, but actually polyester thread is stronger and will likely outlast any cotton thread that you might use. Things to think about though are that it might, if you ever wanted to dye what you've made in the future, the dye won't stick to polyester thread, but if you use cotton thread, the dye will stick to the cotton thread. I'm just going to snip off the end of my thread to make it sharp so I can get it through the needle. That would be a really good start. There we go. And just bring up the bobbin. We're ready to sew. So at Sew Over It, all of our seam allowances are 1.5 centimetres unless we tell you otherwise. And that means that in every step where seam allowance isn't referenced, we just say sew it, go ahead and sew it, it's 1.5 centimetres. It's only if we actually bring up the fact that it's a different seam allowance that you ever have to think about that. So always go with your default of 1.5 with Sew Over It sewing patterns anyway, unless we tell you otherwise. And it's likely only to be perhaps a hem or a neckline edge that will be smaller or bigger. So if nothing is said, 1.5, or if you are an inches person, that's 5/8 of an inch. So I'm going to line up my fabric on my needle plate with the 1.5 mark. I'm going to put my foot down. My stitch length is on a regular stitch length. It's about 2.4 on this machine. That's perfect. I don't have my machine pedal, so I'm just going to get that. That would be a really good start. Plug your machine pedal in so your machine can sew. And then I'm just starting off with a back stitch. My machine's on quite fast, but you can always go slow. There is no rules, go as fast or as slow as you like. Just a straight stitch, of course, on this bit. I do tend to find that if you kind of go really slow, it's sometimes harder to keep nice and straight. So I'd say try at a medium speed. If you're just starting out and you're a little bit nervous, try at a medium speed, you'll probably be fine. And also remember what you're making. You're making a floaty wrap skirt. If there's a little wobble, that's not going to matter. It's not something super fitted. You're going to wrap it around yourself to make it fit you. So any little wobbles are only going to be millimetres, and do not worry too much at all. So I'm just coming up to the end of that seam now. I'm going to slow down. I'm sort of taking my pins out at the last minute there, and a little back stitch. And then on this machine, it's got the magic cutting button, which I love. So the next step on our instructions are to finish this seam. And what that means is, finishing a seam is to finish the raw edges of the fabric in a way that stops them from fraying. So this can kind of be done in two ways. You can do it on your sewing machine, or you can do it on your overlocker. So on a sewing machine, you're going to use a zigzag stitch. That's what I'm going to use today. Because if you've just got a sewing machine at home, I just want to show you how easy it is. So you're just going to place your fabric. So let me be clear, this is on the seam allowance of the seam that we've just sewn. And we're going to zigzag stitch these together. So I'm going to place my fabric underneath my machine foot, and I'm going to change over to a zigzag stitch. So let's have a look. I'm going to put mine up to about 4 width and about 2 length, and all we're doing is sewing right on the edge of our seam allowance, and that thread is going to stop that fabric from unraveling later down the line. So if I go to the top, also my preference is for this zigzag stitch to kind of go off the fabric slightly and wrap around it a bit more like an overlocking stitch. But if yours doesn't, if it's somewhere in the middle, don't worry, that will still do the same job, because it's still going to, perhaps if the zigzag stitch is in the middle of your seam allowance, the edges might fray a bit, but they're going to stop once they hit that zigzag stitch. So kind of either way is still going to protect yourself, but I do think probably having it close to the edge makes it look a bit neater. So pick your battles. If your machine is handling it beautifully, then I would do it sort of towards the edge. But if your machine is being a little bit of a pain in the neck, or you don't feel as confident about doing it close to the edge, do it a little bit in. It's fine. You could always maybe trim off a little bit if you want the best of both worlds. And I'm just starting slow at the start to stop my fabric from getting caught in the machine. And now I can kind of go a bit faster, so I'm just right on the edge of my fabric. I'm going sort of a little bit in. It's not quite wrapping round, but it's going to do the job. And I can speed up for this bit. If you're using an overlocker, then you can also, as you're going, you can trim a little bit off of your seam allowance to make that a tiny bit neater. You could have also trimmed a bit of your seam allowance off before you finish the seam if you want to. That is completely up to you. There's a lot of things in sewing that are just your preference, and you can, kind of the more you sew, the more you'll find out what you like. There we go, coming to the end. I'm just going to do a tiny back stitch, but actually that would be fine. And then hopefully you can see that I've now got a zigzag stitch along the edge of my seam allowance, and you can see sort of I've got some little wispy bits here, but that is as far as they're going to go. They're not going to fray up and get in the way of your seam, and that seam is going to be really nice and strong. So you can sew that one. You can sew your other side seam as well. So remember, match your notches, pin, sew and finish, and then we'll press these seams. So we're going to do our first bit of pressing for this project. There's a lot of pressing in sewing. There's probably almost as much pressing as there is actual sewing. So if you can invest in a nice iron, it will make your life easier, but as long as you have a reliable one, I think that's what's important. I have got an ironing mat here, which is great for situations like this, where I am short on space, but obviously you can have your ironing board as well. And I've also got a cloth. This is just a bit of scrap fabric that I've got that I use as a pressing cloth. You may or may not need it, and to find out if you do need it, I definitely recommend ironing a little scrap of your fabric and seeing how it behaves. Some fabrics, in particular viscose and crepes, if you put too high a heat on them, they might get a little bit shiny, and it's a balance between, do you want that shininess, or do you want the heat up so that you get a nice crisply pressed seam? But with a pressing cloth, you do not have to worry, because this will protect your fabric. So we've got our front and back sewn together. I mean, already I could safety pin this on myself and say it's a skirt, but we're not quite done. We're not quite there. We're going to sew these side seams. We're not going to sew, we're going to press these side seams towards the back. So in sewing instructions, you'll be told to press something, and you'll also be told in which direction to press it. So everything is there for you. And I'm going to start from the inside because I like to see what's going on. And it's quite good to show you actually, because at the top of the skirt, we've got a slight curve. It's straighter down at the bottom, but of this seam around the hips, it is gently curved. And you can kind of see that it won't automatically sit flat one way or the other. And you can also see that where I've handled this fabric, it's got a little wave to it. And you might see that and worry if you sew it yourself, but basically do not worry. A good press can solve so many things. So I know my viscose can take a fairly high heat, so that's on almost the maximum heat. And I'm just going to gently press up to the seam, and I'm just using my hand to slightly pull away on the other side to make sure that's nice and flat. And then I'm going to come up from the other side. Ooh, that is very warm. And do the same. And then once I've done that, I am going to hover over and press that seam allowance over to the back. And you can see that with a bit of heat and a lot of steam, that wave in my fabric that it had, that's gone now. It just needs to kind of be told to get back into position. So just going to do a bit more of this side. Do the same again, just using a tiny bit of tension. So I'm not stretching at all. I'm just making sure that that seam is sort of flat against the pressing mat. And just going underneath the seam there, and finally just on the top. And you see how beautifully this viscose presses. It makes a lot of difference if you can find a fabric that will press really nicely for you. And then once I've ironed the seam from the inside, I tend to flip over, have a little look. Obviously from the inside you want it neat, but from the outside you want it neater. And I think I could give that one more little press. Again, just a tiny little bit of tension just to sort of pull out any folds. If I was using my pressing cloth, I would get the area lined up that I wanted to press. Get my pressing cloth, put it on top like this, and then just press as you would. It's not a case of like ironing up and down, it's more like little movements. Just focusing on the areas you do want to press. And like I said, it's got a bit of a curve in this area, so don't expect everything to lie flat. Sewing is all about creating shapes. There aren't a huge amount of shapes in this skirt, so you don't need any fancy pressing tools, but just don't expect the whole thing to lie flat because we're not making something flat. So you can go ahead, make sure one seam is pressed, press the other one as well with the seam allowance to the back also, and then we will do some more finishing of seams. So we're at step 3 now in our instructions, and we are going to be finishing the edges of the front, so the front of the bit that wraps and also the hem, and you want to do that quite lightly with a bit of a light touch. You don't want that to kind of stretch as you're doing it. I'm going to show you on the overlocker now what it's like to finish a seam on an overlocker, but you can also do it with a zigzag stitch. The main point is that if you're using an overlocker, you've obviously got a blade on there and you don't want to chop any of your fabric off. You want to leave it intact. If you've got a wobbly seam, maybe done some wobbly cutting, that's fine. Chop that bit off, but only use the blade as a means to just smooth an edge rather than to actually get rid of any fabric. So first, you've got to work out where your waist is. There it is. So it's obviously the smaller edge of your skirt, but you could, if you're struggling with that, you could always use like a fabric marker or some chalk, or even pop a pin in so you know which is the waist edge. It's also on this skirt, it's got a little notched corner there, so you know that that is your waist edge. So when I'm finishing the seam, actually, it's a good point. I'm actually going to ignore this notched corner. So this is a bit of seam allowance that's going to be used to help position your waistband. You can see that that little sort of notched edge is only 1.5 centimeters long, and that means that that's all going to be hidden in your seam allowance. So rather than trying to be super precise, finish that tiny bit, pivot, then finish down here, I'm just going to start here instead. So you can always have a think of what is caught in your seam allowance, what will be seen, what won't be seen, and make decisions like that as well. But we'll pretty much always tell you what to do as well. So on my overlocker, I'm lining up the edge of my fabric with the blade, but just at it rather than over. And some little threads are going to be snipped off, but nothing major. And then I'm just handling the fabric really nice and lightly, helping it through a bit, but not pulling on it. Same on the sewing machine as well. You can get some speed up if your machine or your table allows it. But otherwise, kind of neatness is the name of the game, I think, with this step. So if you are interested in overlocking, we do have a masterclass on overlocking on our website. So if you don't know already, we sell sewing patterns, but we also have an online classroom as well called Stitch School that's been going for 5 years now. We hadn't counted for a while and cannot believe it's that long. So Stitch School, our online classroom, has, at the time of recording, has over 230 classes on it, and that is a mix of things that we call master classes. So they're like really big classes. They usually involve a pattern or they involve a specific skill. So we have the Ultimate Guide to Trousers, which includes 2 trouser patterns and will involve fitting information, sewing information, help with styling, lots of different things. Or there might be a class on pattern drafting, which will show you how to draft a pattern from your own measurements and how to get like a bodice block or something like that. And we've also got a masterclass on overlocking. I went a bit too fast. So you can find out all of the information, all of the different things that your overlocker can do that you didn't really know it did. I think it's fair to say that I learned a lot when we were researching for that one. But everything unstitchable you can access with a premium subscription, which is £15 a month. That means you get access to absolutely everything. Or you can just do a basic subscription, which is £5 a month, and that means you get access to all of our small tutorials. So that will be things like how to put in a zip, or how to fit a particular problem, or how to learn one particular skill. So they are shorter videos. Some of them are actually there's some fitting ones on there that are still quite hearty, and there is a lot of content on there still for £5 a month, if that is more what you fancy. Or option 3, if you prefer, you can buy all of these or most of these classes outright as well. So if you're not one for subscriptions, but you'd still like to learn, things like the intro to overlocking class are available just to buy. But yeah, have a look. This all came from all of our teaching in person. So if you don't know about us, we used to have classes in London, in-person classes over 2 shops, for, I'm gonna say, 8 or 9 years. So we're founded in teaching, and we love to share and keep up that teaching. So I don't think I talked about overlooking much there, but there's not much to it. It's just going to finish that seam. It does finish it really, really nicely, and it gives it that kind of slightly professional look more than a zigzag stitch, but a zigzag stitch still does the same job. It still protects your seams. So yeah, there's the kind of choice that you have in finishes. If you've just got the sewing machine, zigzag, absolutely fine. If you've got an overlocker, then you can choose whichever you like. And once you have overlocked or zigzag stitch, so that was the front edge around the bottom of the hem and the other front edge, then we will move on to pressing these edges and making them really neat. So what we're going to be doing now is hemming our skirt, and we're going to hem both front edges and the bottom hem as well. So the first thing we're going to do is press up the front edges, wrong sides together. So that's pressing up the front edges 1 centimetre towards the inside of your skirt. So let's have a look. I've got my front edge here, and obviously you want to make this nice and even. I was just snipping off my threads as I go, just because that is a very bad habit of mine that I don't do and then have a million threads at the end. So I've got my overlocking here. You might have your zigzag stitch, and I've got my tape measure. It's going to help me press over 1 centimetre. So there's kind of different ways you can do this. You can keep using your tape measure. I tend to quite like to fold it over till it gets to that 1 centimetre line and press it like that. I know my tape measure's got a metal end, so it won't get melted if I just press along the edge. What's also useful, more so I think with overlocking, but it will work with a zigzag stitch as well, is to measure how deep your finishing is. So my overlocking is 6mm, and then you can kind of use that as a guide. Once you've started sewing, and once you get used to this, things like 1 centimetre, 1.5 centimetres, maybe 2 and 3 as well, will become a lot easier for you to gauge. So if I'm really honest, if I was at home, I wouldn't even be using this. I'd just be looking, thinking my overlocking is 6mm, so that just needs to be just over half of what I'm turning over. It's a bit naughty, but these sort of things will become second nature. And why don't I do that? Let's see. I'll embarrass myself now. Do you know what? I've got 9mm. I'm not too unhappy about that. So yeah, so otherwise you can go rogue like I do. Sometimes that's more fun. But obviously if you want to do things super accurately, then you can use your tape measure. You can get things called a hot hemmer, lots of different brands do them now, where they are a piece of, it might be plastic or something, but something that doesn't melt in particular, that has all the different measurements on, and they're quite long and you can hold them underneath what you're hemming, fold it up to the right measurement and just pop your iron on, and they withstand the heat. They are very, very handy, but a tape measure will do just fine. In most cases, your eye will do just fine. Just want to make sure if you are doing it by eye, you're doing it really nice and smoothly. Don't want anything jutting in or out. And my fabric, you can see, is holding the press so well that I haven't needed to pin it on this side. But I'll just show you, if yours wasn't holding a press, what I would have done would be placing a pin in as I go, like this, because then the next step is to flip your fabric over and move those pins to the right side, because that's the side we'll be sewing on. So if you've got pins on the wrong side like this, flip your fabric over, which is quite a lot at this stage, and move your pins over. And at this point you want to think about how you're going to sew this. So this is going to go into the sewing machine this way. We're going to be sewing on this side, on the right side of the fabric. So my pins I want to have with the head facing towards me, so they'll be easy to pull out as I go. So when I'm moving them over to the right side, I'm actually changing the orientation, because I naturally put them in that position on the wrong side, but of course, because we've flipped over, that's not right anymore. So you can put them in lengthways like this. I naturally prefer to be a perpendicular pinner. So pinning like this, usually, but on quite a narrow hem like this, only 1 centimetre, I think pins going lengthways seems to make more sense to me. It's going to hold more of the fabric down, and you can get really close to it whilst you're sewing, so your fabric's not going to go anywhere. So you want to pin this in place, and if your fabric is allowing those pins to stay in place, some fabrics the pins seem to work their way out, but if your fabric is like mine, the pins don't seem to be going anywhere, I'd recommend going ahead and doing the same on the other front edge too. So then you'll have 2 front edges ready to top stitch. So we're top stitching the fronts of our wrap skirt now, and we're going to sew from the right side of the fabric. So that means that we can't see the where the seam ends underneath, but we know we turned over 1 centimetre, so all we need to think about is that we're going to sew just a little bit less than 1 centimetre away from that folded edge that we've just pressed. So what you can do is line up under your machine. You're just going to have a mess around, if you can get your thread to work, there we go, where you think might be best. I'm looking at my machine and I'm thinking, if I line up with the edge of my foot, I think that's just going to miss it actually. I've lined up with the edge of my foot. I'm on my straight stitch again, but I'm going to move my needle position a little bit closer to the edge of my foot. So I'm just going to move that across. If you can't move your needle position on your machine, then you're just going to have to move your fabric instead. That is fine. I think that looks pretty good, but what I'm going to do to double check is lift my foot up and put my fabric underneath, but from the wrong side, to see if that is going to catch that edge. It is. I've got a good few millimeters to spare, so I'm happy with that. With top stitching, sometimes it can be nice to have a longer stitch length. Visually it looks a little bit nicer, so maybe up to 3 rather than sort of 2.5, 2.4 that you will have been sewing with. Also, if you use a longer stitch length, any wobbles that you might make are less exaggerated really. If you make a little wobble with lots of little stitches, it records that whole wobble, but if you make a wobble with a longer stitch length, part of that wobble will be in the bit where the needle's sort of up in the air before it comes down, if that makes sense. So those little wobbles are slightly calmed, for want of a better word. So it's the machine working in your favour. There's nothing wrong with using it to get the results you want. So I'm going up the front edge of one of the sides of my wrap skirt. Start with a little back stitch as always. And then I'm just keeping my fabric aligned with the edge of my foot. I'm taking the pins out as I go. As they're in sort of lengthways, I can get quite close to them, which is very handy. Maybe I should have organised this fabric before I started sewing, but you can always just stop like I've done and give it another go. Also, just find a place, I think, for where you pop your pins as well. I really like having them here in the sort of heart of the machine. But find a little spot for you so that when you take them out, it's not like it's part of the process, if that makes sense. So usually if I had a pin and it was pinned this way across the fabric, it's really easy for me to just whip it out onto my pin dish there. It's a little bit different because these are in a different orientation, but it still works pretty easily. Go. Little back stitch there and cut my threads. Let's have a look. I think that is caught all the way along. I'm happy with that. If ever you take your fabric off the machine and it's not caught all the way along, do not unpin the whole seam. There's no point in doing that. Just unpin the little section that isn't caught, maybe a few centimetres either side, and just sew that little bit again. Yeah, there's no point in doing the whole seam if it's just a couple of centimetres that needs redoing. And also you might find that maybe after it's been through your machine it's got a little bit of a wave to it, or it just looks like it's been handled more, because it has. Don't worry about it. We'll just go and press it afterwards again to just sort of calm the fabric down. So you just want to make sure both of your front edges are top stitch, and then we'll be turning up the hem. So we've done our front edges now. This is hot off the presses, hot off the sewing machine. And you can see it's a little bit wavy, so no problem. I'm just gonna press that gently to get rid of that wave. If things come off your machine and they look more wobbly than when they went on, a press will usually solve the problem. And the same on this side. I really like this fabric. I think this is going to be great. Maybe not with this top, this is quite a lot, but just with the plain t-shirt I think will be fab. Okay, so just what we did before, which is turning up by 1 centimetre, but this time it is the hem. So I'm going to start on this side, and I'm going to use my usual technique of doing it by eye, but of course measure as you go if you prefer. Just as long as it's really nice and uniform. If you're doing it like this, be careful of your fingers. Definitely have burnt myself before doing this, even though I've kind of developed asbestos hands through sewing. When you get to your seam allowances, just make sure they're all pressed in the same direction. So these side seams should be going towards the back. But yeah, if you are just starting out, if you are joining me from the Beginner's Guide to Sewing, hello, then don't forget there's all sorts of tips in there and links to Stitchable videos for things that you might think are second nature, but actually it's just handy to have a teacher there to say, hey, this is how you do it. For example, I wasn't really aware when I started sewing that ironing and pressing were two different things. Sometimes it helps to have someone with just a bit of knowledge, a bit more experience to help you, especially with those basics, I think, because things like pressing things really well, so like instead of ironing like this, like you'd iron sheets, as if I iron my bed sheets, or you'd iron a pair of trousers. When you're pressing seams, you're thinking about the specific part of the garment you're pressing. I'm not pressing all of this, I'm focusing on my hem, and I'm trying not to interrupt the rest of the fabric too much, because I only want to focus on this area, and it's more about concentrated heat, thinking about a certain area, than getting the whole thing flat. And it's little tips like that that can set you up for making really, really nice things that can kind of level up your makes. So yeah, do have a look on Stitchable. If you've ever come to any of our London classes, you'll find a lot of our teachers from there on Stitchable. Now we don't have the classes in person, they are part of our Stitchable gang, but also a lot taught by myself and also Alma from the Sew Over It team as well. So there's lots of different people to learn from. And I think that's good because there's a lot of different types of skills, and also a lot of different ways of sewing and attitudes to sewing. And it's nice that you can find people that match up with what you like to do as well. But anyway, I'll stop waffling. I've ironed up my skirt hem. So as before, you might have been pinning as you're going if your fabric isn't holding a press quite as nicely as mine is. Some do, some don't. I think the more natural your fabric is, the more likely it will hold a press, but if you're using a crepe, it might not. No problem, just use your pins to help you. And then from the right side, I'm popping my pins in, and it's just the same as before, and this will take a while, so I will leave you and see you back on the sewing machine. So we're going to top stitch our hem in the exact same way we did the front edges. We're going to line up everything as we did with the edge of the foot. I'm just looking at my sewing machine, and I haven't done any other sewing since that, so all of my needle positions and my stitch lengths are in the same place, which is perfect. Hopefully that will be the same for you, so you don't even have to think about it. But if you are doing a project where you're swapping between top stitching and regular sewing, as it were, then it can be really handy to write down your top stitching needle position and stitch length. Whack it on a post-it on your machine so you can always go back to it. You don't have to worry about remembering it, and then all your top stitching will be beautiful and matching. But in this case, because these bits of sewing are kind of consecutive, you shouldn't have to do that, which is very handy. It's almost like we thought about it. So I'm just going to top stitch along this seam. And I'm thinking actually about what I am going to wear with this. So the top I've got on is the Adele top at the moment. She comes free as part of VIP Club 2024. So VIP Club is like a special club for our customers that really love a bit of all things Sew Over It, love a bit of a sneaky discount, love a bit of behind the scenes gossip, and love getting the patterns first. So if you become a VIP for 2024, you get the Adele top pattern. You also get one free PDF pattern of your choice, a code for that, which will come through to your inbox. You get a discount on all the new patterns, and you get deeper sale discounts too, so there's a lot. But I waffled. Long story short, I'm basically thinking of a white version, I think. Like a cream version of Adele would look really nice with the skirt. Oh, actually maybe even the green as well. There's quite a lot of colours in here that I hadn't kind of realised that I might wear. So something like that will make it a bit of a staple. We've also got the Ultimate t-shirt too, which has a lot of options, which I could go for as well, but I like the scoop. I like the scoop on Adele. I think it would look really nice. And on this wrap skirt as well, you've got two lengths, so I've gone for the longer length, but there's also a shorter length too. I really like a midi skirt, but if one around the knee length is better for you, then you can go for that, and obviously use a bit less fabric as well. No harm in that. So I think I'm just coming back round to the front, just just trying to keep everything even. Like I said, I'm kind of handling everything quite lightly. I'm not pulling anything anywhere. Letting the machine do the hard work. And we're just coming up to the end there. All right. Just leave that pin. I'm actually kind of using it just to hold down right at the edge whilst I get there, because keep my fingers away from the needle basically. You hear enough horror stories about that. There we go. I can just trim this a little bit closer. Definitely recommend a little pair of snips to keep by your sewing machine. And there we go, that's our hem sewn. So we've got a lot of skirt done already, and we're going to move on to the waistband, which first of all starts with some ironing and some interfacing. So make sure you've got your interfacing cut out, and then we'll go and press it onto your waistband pieces. Just before I do my interfacing on my waistband, I am just going to give this a little press along the hem, just to show you again that it might do this. It might sort of look a little bit fluted, but just tell it to get back into position. Stop behaving like that with a little bit of an iron. And then we're actually going to put this to one side whilst we do the waistband. So this is just to calm it down a bit after that sewing. There we go. Really like it though. I'm quite surprised how much I like this one. Right, he can wait over here. Very glamorous. So, waistband. Sip of coffee first. First thing we're going to do is put on our interfacing. And our interfacing goes on two pieces of the waistband. So we've got waistband section B, and we've got waistband section A. We've also got two waist ties. These don't have any interfacing. Pop them to one side. So let's start with the smaller one. That'll be easier to see. Waistband section B. And this is cut one with the fabric right side up, which is what I have done. So my fabric is right side up, and that's on there, cut one, and I've got cut one interfacing as well. And I've got my interfacing here. Before you take your pattern pieces fully off, you want to check for any notches. Specifically on the waistband on this skirt, we've got some notches at the end there, and they are very important because they are part of how the wrap skirt wraps essentially. So make sure you have notched those notches. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's nothing else I need from that pattern piece. You can go away. So I'm just going to interface this now. I'm just going to run my iron over there. It's just got a bit folded whilst it was sat there. I'm also going to move these pins out of the way. I put them in a very daft position. So with interfacing, there's kind of a few schools of thought. You can put your interfacing with glue sides up, place your fabric on top. Your fabric is likely to be a lot more fluid than your interfacing. So you might need to sort of just manipulate it so it sits. But hopefully you can see on my waistband that my cutting hasn't been wholly accurate. And I've got a little bit of interfacing poking out here. If that happens to you, that's absolutely fine. But I would say that if you're ironing it with the glue side up, if I iron this now, like this glue is going to stick to my iron. So personally, I prefer to do it the other way around, so that any messy little bits of glue from your interfacing will stick to your ironing board rather than your iron, because ironing board covers are a lot cheaper than irons to replace if they get all sticky and messy. So again, just manipulating that fabric so it's sitting nice and straight. And you can also test this out on a little scrap as well. That's a really good idea. But you want your iron usually on around a medium heat. And again, we're definitely not like ironing like this. We're just pressing. I tend to just start. I'm going to slow the steam down a bit. Just start at the edge. and see what that's doing. You can always go hotter, so I'd start cool and then go a bit hotter. So that seems to be working quite nicely. Yeah, I'm quite confident in that. It doesn't seem to be shrinking up. Sometimes if you put the iron on too high, the interfacing just goes whoop and disappears. And it's not doing that. So I'm just gonna hold this on gently for a few seconds. These little bits at the edge, they probably are sticking to my ironing mat, but that's fine. If you find that you need a higher heat to make your interfacing stick, but your fabric can't take it, use your pressing cloth again. Pop your pressing cloth over, pop your heat up a little bit, and you can do it that way. And that way your fabric and your interfacing is protected, but you're getting that higher heat, which is going to allow the glue to melt to make the interfacing stick to whatever pieces you're interfacing, and provide you with that little bit of extra stability that it needs. So let's have a look at that. I think that's looking really good. It's nice and neat. I can trim all these bits off afterwards. Thing to note is maybe just make sure you can still see your notches. So I might just give them a little tease, or you can snip them again as well, but just open them up a little bit. Where's that one? There he is. Just so that when it comes to it, we know where those are. So you want to make sure waistband piece A, no, this is waistband piece B. Waistband piece B is interfaced. Go ahead and interface waistband piece A as well, and then we'll do a bit of sewing. Okay, so we got waistband piece A and waistband piece B. Piece A is the longer one of the two. Piece B is the shorter. And we're going to be joining them along the short edge where all these notches are. And what we're going to be doing, we're not going to be sewing all in one go. We're going to be sewing little sections of this in a way that later on it means there will be a little gap left that we will feed a tie through, and that is how your skirt, your wrap skirt, will kind of work. So I have got piece A and piece B. I can see all my notches, so I just tease those apart to make sure I can see them. And I'm going to pin strategically. I'm going to pin at each one of those notches because they are the things that are telling us where and when to start and stop stitching. So that's the first, the second notch, third notch, and the fourth. And I'll just show you on the instructions as well. So you might see that we use different colours for if you're looking at the inside of the skirt, so the wrong side of the fabric, or the outside, which is the right side of the fabric. And then also you might see this sort of dappled texture as well, and that's for pieces that have been interfaced, like my waistband. And actually this is a step when I was talking about seam allowance, is that they're always 1.5, apart from when we say they're not. So in this step, we will be sewing this seam with a 1 centimetre seam allowance because it specifically says in the instructions. So let's get sewing. Let me just move my sewing machine over. Oh, it's a bit of a beast. You want to go nice and slow. And if you've been doing top stitching, change your machine back to its regular settings. We're using a 1 centimetre seam allowance now. So line up with your 1 centimetre mark on your machine. And as this is part of the waistband, I think it needs to be a nice, like, solid bit of stitching. So a really good back stitch. And I'm going to go nice and slow up to that first pin. And when I get close, I'm just going to use the hand wheel until I'm pretty much on it. There we go. Because I used the hand wheel, I was kind of able to keep the pin in there and just take it out now. And I am going to go back again with my back stitch. So each little bit of sewing is basically its own teeny tiny seam. So from the middle, I'm lining up with my 1 centimetre seam allowance marker on my needle plate. I'm going in just ahead of the pin where I want to start sewing, because I want a little bit of room to back stitch. So I'm gonna back stitch, but I'm also gonna use a hand wheel so I don't slam my needle into that pin. There we go. Forward just a tad, use my hand wheel again, and then back stitch. There we go. So you've got 1.5 centimeters of stitching at the start, one in the middle, and then one last bit to finish off this seam. A little back stitch to secure it, get rid of that pin, and then off to the end. So then once you've sewn this, we'll move over and do a bit more pressing. Okay, so this seam has been sewn, and we're just going to press this seam allowance open, including the little bit that hasn't been sewn, those two little sections that are open. So I'm just going to use my fingers to sort of gently press that open where I want it. Because my hands are quite warm, that's already helping press that open. But obviously the iron will do a proper job. There we go. Flip that over, have a look. So hopefully we might be able to see that there's now two little gaps in there, and that will be when our waistband is folded over and attached. That is where our tie will go through. So a lot of times when you're sewing things, you're sewing like mirror images, or you're sewing two exact same things in the exact same way. With wrap dresses or wrap skirts or anything asymmetrical, it's slightly different. So say if you're sewing two dots or something like that, two mirror images, it doesn't kind of matter which way round you do it in a certain way, because you'll always end up with one on one side, one on the other. With a wrap skirt, this is constructed in a particular way, so it wraps in a certain way. When it comes down to it, if you do it the wrong way around, it's not actually a problem. It just means your skirt will wrap on one side rather than the other. I have 3 or 4 of these wrap skirts, and one of them definitely wraps the other way around because I didn't use the instructions at all. But if you're being good and you're paying attention to the instructions, now is the time to get them out again, to just get it really clear about which way round we're doing things. So that's what I'm going to do. So let's have a look. We are on step 12. No, we're not. First of all, we're on step 11, and we're going to press this waistband in half lengthways. So that is this way, and that is wrong sides together. Let's get those out of the way. And we're just pressing to put a little fold in that top edge that's going to become the top of our waistband. Make sure that when you get to that little seam, that is lining up nicely. And run all the way along this longer piece as well. You can see that the interfacing is going to give it a bit more stability on you. It's going to stop it creasing around your waist. And it's also going to stop it stretching out of shape as well. Also, if you do have, or if you don't have rather, if you don't have a long piece of interfacing, but you've got lots of smaller pieces, as long as it's all the same weight, you can kind of piece it together and just attach it piece by piece. It means that you can get a lot more life out of long pieces of interfacing or scraps of interfacing, because it's hidden. It's not like a fabric like this where you'd see if that was all little different pieces of fabric. You can piece it together, and I don't mean sew it together, I just mean place it on, iron one bit here, iron the next bit here, the next bit there, and it can do the job. Instead of buying interfacing per project, just have a big stash of interfacing and just mix and match, use what you can where you can. So that it's been folded in half. You're going to open it out again, and we're going to make sure that waistband B, the shorter waistband, is on the right as we look at it. So that was this one here, and we're going to press this lower edge up by 1.5 centimeters. Now, this is the time where I probably wouldn't go rogue, because later on I know that this is going to be quite important in making sure everything sits together. So I am going to measure this one. So I'm going to get my tape measure and I'm pressing up this bottom edge. Actually, I prefer to press from sort of this direction. That feels more natural to me. It might not be to you, so I've swapped it around and I'm going to fold over this top edge here, but that is essentially the same, not even essentially, it is the same edge. I've just swapped it around. Just for me, folding things forward and pressing is more natural, but you will have your own way. So I'm going to get my iron for 1.5 centimeters. So once you've got your iron, you can continue measuring all the way along, or you can do a little bit, come back, and then strategically measure again. I feel like I've got a lot of things all tangled up there. And that can just keep you on the right track. Another thing you can do as well, which you can use in other projects, is you could run a length of stitching down here. So you could pop this under your sewing machine and run a length of, say, machine tacking. So a fairly long stitch, maybe about 4 in stitch length, at 1.5 centimeters from the edge of the fabric. So that'll be really easy to sew, because that's the seam allowance that you usually sew with. And then when you take that off the machine, you'll basically have a line to press along. And that can be very useful. I mean, it'd be very useful here, but particularly if you are turning over a curved hem, they can be a little bit more fiddly than turning over something straight. And if you have that line of stitching, it can basically just do the job for you. And it's almost, on a curved hem, it's almost like the stitching sort of guides the fabric a bit, I guess, because there's a tiny bit more tension there because there's a stitch. When you fold it, the stitching line almost immediately says, yes, fold here, please. And that's a really handy way to do things. I don't think it's necessary, it's particularly necessary on a nice straight edge like this, but it will be a good way to practice the technique. If you've got a complete lack of tape measures for some reason in your house, it would totally work. So do whatever suits you best. Just making sure that you're folding over that 1.5. You can use a bit of steam now if you might have taken that off when you were doing your interfacing, but you can use it now if that helps. On my last bit. And then once you've done this ironing, you're going to grab your waistband tie pieces and we're going to create those ties. Obviously, just as I'm doing this, I just thought it goes without saying, but try not to iron your entire tape measure because most of them are made of plastic and they will melt to your iron. I think we all know someone that's been there, not naming names. There we go. So that's that bit done. So if it's like the instructions, if I turn it around to how it was before, we've got waistband B on the right hand side as we look at it, and the bottom edge is turned up by 1.5 centimeters. So you can just pop that to one side. And whilst we're here without the sewing machine, I'm just going to grab my tie pieces as well. So you've got 2 tie pieces. You've got one long tie piece and one short tie piece. So let's have a look. Is that long? No, that's short, and this one is long. We're going to be dealing with them both. I'll just show you on the shorter one, but we'll be doing the same to the longer one as well. And we're just going to be folding it right sides together and popping a pin in, because we're going to be sewing along this short edge and also all the way along the long edge as well. You can see this is a lot lighter weight because it doesn't have that interfacing on, but that means it'll be really nice and soft, and it'll tie a really nice bow for your skirt. So go ahead And pin both of your tie pieces in exactly the same way, and then we will sew them, and then we will turn them through, and then we will attach the waistband to your skirt, and you'll pretty much have a skirt done. Okay, so we're back at the sewing machine. I've just got my short tie here. You'll have your short tie and your long tie pinned along the long edge and pinned along the short edge too. And we are sewing with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance again here. So under the foot, everything looks regular on my machine. So normal stitch length, 2.4 for me. Around there for you is good. Start with the back stitch. And you're just going to whiz along this straight edge, just making sure your raw edge is aligned. Very nice and easy. Hopefully sewing something like this that's so nice and easy to fit and comes together quite quickly will give you a little bit of confidence in what you might want to tackle next. If you are using the Beginner's Guide to Sewing ebook, then obviously there's the Ultimate Pyjamas in there, which are a great next project. It's a great introduction to how trousers are constructed and what the sort of different shapes of trouser legs look like, because they can look a bit alien to begin with. So I'm just coming up to the short end, and I've got an itchy nose, excuse me. And I'm gonna slow down my sewing because I want to stop 1.5 centimetres from the end, so I can pivot and sew down this short edge. So I'll go a bit slower. And usually it's another one of those things that you might find you can get your eye in for. I'm going to try that, lift my foot, turn around my fabric, and actually that's lining up with the 2 centimetres on my needle plate, so that is not far enough. I'm going to go 2 more stitches. That's perfect. I'm at 1.5 now, so as long as your needle's down, then you can pivot your heart away. But once you're lined up again on that short edge, it's foot down, and just finish off that sewing. There we go. So that's that sewn. You've got a nice pivoted short edge there. So once you've done that for your short tie and your long tie, then we will go over to the ironing board. I talk about that like it's a different place. I'll still be here. You walk over to your ironing board and we will trim these and turn them through and press them. So you've got your 2 ties now. I've got my shorter one and my longer one. I'll just demo on the shorter one, but everything you're doing on the shorter one, you do on the longer one. And we're just going to trim this seam allowance down. And all that is to reduce the bulk that's going to be inside this tie once we turn it through to the right side. So I'm trimming that down to about half its width. It doesn't have to be absolutely half its width. Just anything around there that is gonna get rid of some of that bulk. It might not be the case in this project, I think it probably won't be at all, but if you are sewing something that's really bulky and you want to trim down seam allowance, if you chop off both seam allowances like this, it can end up with quite a hard edge. So if you were using maybe a wool or something like that, or you had more layers, perhaps there were 4 pieces sewn in there, it might give you quite a hard edge. And what you can do in that case, I can just demonstrate, is something called grading your seam allowance. And it might be that you trim 1 seam allowance. So my scissors are just cutting 1 piece of fabric now, a little shorter. That's maybe about 2/3 of the way in. And then I cut my second piece of seam allowance at about half where we were before. And what that then gives you is it's getting rid of the bulk, but it gives you a sort of graduated edge rather than a hard edge. So if you've got anything bulky in any future sewing projects, or even perhaps it might be something simple like a tote bag or a toiletries bag, but you're using a bulky fabric, because you might use something more like a canvas for those sort of projects, then doing something like grading your seam allowance. It's just one of those little things you can do to make things just a little bit nicer, a little bit fancier. We all like a bit of fancy every now and then. So I'm just going to chop the end off as well. And then we're going to turn this through to the right side. This is a little bit of a long job, but it's a decent size tie, so it shouldn't be too tricky. It's just getting that first turn and then pulling it up from the inside. Can be a little bit faffy. We can chat while we're here. So I think I was saying about maybe next projects as well that you could do. We have the Beginner's Guide to Dressmaking ebook as well, which is another sort of beginner's project, but it's one step on from sewing. It's perhaps if you want to explore more garment sewing and you want to think about dresses and you want to think about fitting things differently. So in that ebook there is an A-line skirt in which you will put in an invisible zip, so that's a new skill. You'll also be cutting on the bias as well. So the bias of fabric, you have fabric and it's woven, you have threads this way, threads that way. They're very stable. This edge and this edge are very stable, but if you cut this way, if you pull on fabric this way, it will stretch and it will give, and that can be a positive and a negative. Things that are cut on the bias can be beautiful and the fabric can hang really nicely because it's not on those hard straight grains, but also means when you're handling them that it can be a bit of a pain in the neck sometimes. So you'll learn how to both cut and sew with bias fabrics. There is a t-shirt made out of jersey fabric, so you'd learn how to handle jersey fabric, how to make a really nice everyday wearable basic t-shirt, how to put in a neckband, and how to put in sleeves as well, which is a bit of a key skill in sewing. And then there's also a shift dress as well, where you will learn about facings and different fabrics and basically sort of cutting and choosing a size for your whole body rather than just a top or a bottom. And then after that, really, the world's your oyster. I think there's kind of two ways to look at it. You can, and it depends on your attitude to sewing, because you can dive in and go for what you love wearing, even though it might be a little bit tricky to sew. That is my preferred method. But just be aware that if you're going that way, you're probably going to make some mistakes and you might end up with a couple of things that you don't like because it's not turned out the way you wanted it to. I'm speaking from very much from experience. So as long as you're okay with that, as long as you're okay with making mistakes and you're not going to beat yourself up over it, it's quite a fun way to learn how to sew. And I think you gain skills quite quickly because you're testing yourself and you're pushing yourself. But be aware that some things might not be perfect. If you prefer to take it slow, then that's also fine. It's just a different way of doing things. And it might be that you don't up your skills quite as quickly, but you have more things in your wardrobe that you love, and you learn those skills in a kind of more, I'm trying to think of the right word, more sort of stable way, in a more structured way. So yeah, you choose which route you want to take, or a bit of both, to be honest. I think that's why having these online classes are so helpful, in that you can maybe try something that's a little bit out of your skill set, but you've got a teacher there and you've got someone guiding you. So that can be a way that you can kind of jump your skills up quite a bit and take a few more risks. And obviously all projects can be very different depending on the fabric that you use. So for example, if you want to make a very, very basic top, you might be very competent at all the skills involved in that, but maybe you want to challenge yourself by using a really slippery, floaty fabric, or perhaps adding a lining where there wasn't a lining, or perhaps you're interested in pattern drafting and you could start by changing a neckline. There's so many ways, I think, that you could just add in some different bits of skills to keep you interested, but also so you have lovely things as well. It's all a bit of both. I'm almost at the end. Who knew I could talk through an entire turning of the tie? I think I knew. So once you've done this, you'll also want to do the long tie as well. But I won't make you watch through that. It's exactly the same process. I'll just do it on the short one. We're almost there. I was trying to think back to the things that I first made. I actually dived into sewing with quilting to begin with. With hand sewing a quilt, I made a very ambitious hexagon quilt that took me a couple of years, but I just worked on it slowly. And then after that, I went straight to a dress. I'd already kind of fallen in love with sewing a bit, and I went straight into quite complicated dresses, going out dresses. I used a lot of patterns from By Hand London at the time, because that was quite a bit of my style at the time, was more the dressier dresses. And I definitely did make some mistakes, but I was also really, really proud of what I'd made. And I think it's just that liberation that it gives you, that spurs you on. But yeah, I would say, above all, give yourself time and don't tell yourself off if you make a mistake. Would you tell someone else off if they made that mistake? You wouldn't, so don't tell yourself off. There, those are my lessons for today. All right, we're just getting to the end. And it all looks a bit kind of clumpy and weird, so I'm just going to get a pin and really gently just tease out those corners to get it a bit of a nicer shape. There we go. That is quite nice. And then we're going to press this and we're going to roll the seam. And all rolling the seam means is that you're kind of rolling the fabric like this to make sure that seam is right on the edge there. It's not sort of up onto your tie, it's right on the edge. And it will probably quite naturally want to do this anyway. But just use your fingers. I'm just teasing this out a little bit more. It wasn't as neat as I wanted it to be. There we go, that's a bit better. So use your fingers to roll that right to the edge, and then get your iron to press as you go. But just that rolling motion will get it sitting where you want it to. There might be other points in different projects where you might roll a seam to a certain side, so you might roll it to the inside, and therefore it's not seen as much on the outside of your garment or at all. And it's just the same process, it's just where you finish your roll. And it's very satisfying when it's all wiggly from being turned through, and then you can roll it so the seam's perfectly on the edge and press it, and you get these really nice ties. So there we go. Yeah, that is my short tie. I'm going to do the same with the long tie, and then we are going to be attaching the waistband to the skirt. So we're coming into waistband town now, if that's a thing. I don't know if that's a thing. We'll see if it sticks. So we've got that waistband piece where we pressed up one edge. I've got all my ties that are now beautifully pressed, lovely. I'm going to put those to one side for a sec because we don't need those right now. We are just going to pin our waistband onto our skirt. So the first thing I'm going to do is find my waist. It's the one edge of your skirt that isn't hemmed and top stitched now. And I'm going to lay that down with our right sides facing up, facing towards us. And then you're going to get your waistband and put that right side facing down. And that means that waistband piece B, the shorter piece, is going to be on the right hand side. So the first thing I'm going to do is align that seam. So I've got the side seam, and then I've got the seam that we sewed that's got those little gaps in it. And I'm going to put that in place. And then actually at the front edge, you want this to have a 1.5 centimetre overlap. So we've got the skirt, and that is going to be 1.5 centimetres smaller than the waistband. So I'm going to measure that, she says. Looking for a tape measure, there we go. And that is because something's going to be sewn on at that point. So 1.5. Going to line that up so we have a 1.5 centimetre overlap there. And that is the same with the other side as well. Let me sniff off those threads. So again, get those threads as well. I'm measuring 1.5, and then where the end of my tape measure is, that's where I'm going to start pinning it to the waistband. There we go. And then you've got various notches on this waistband, and I might just identify them a bit clearer for a second. So we have got a centre back notch, a side seam notch, and a centre front notch. So what's always a good thing to do is to put your side seams together actually, and make yourself a little extra centre back notch. If any pattern doesn't have this, some do, some don't, it's kind of always useful to put it in, because it's just nice to get that balance right of when you're pinning things together, and it's just kind of handy to know where your centre back is. So pinning that centre back in place, and then I've got my side seam as well, and then everything should ease in after that. Just make sure when you're pinning that your side seam allowance is pointing in the right direction so it doesn't get twisted. So now those key points are pinned in, I can then just hold my fabric and pin in the gaps. These should match pretty much like for like, but obviously the only difference is that your waistband is interfaced and hasn't been handled much. You've just interfaced it and sewn one seam, and the waist of your skirt isn't interfaced. And also you've kind of sewn those seams, you've top stitched, you've flung it around a bit. So it might have just eased a little bit. So it might be, I don't know if you can see, that it looks like the skirt piece is a little bit bigger. It essentially probably is a tiny bit bigger at this stage, but not to the extent that it's not going to fit, just to the extent that you might want to pop in 1 or 2 more pins to make sure it stays where you want it to stay. Because obviously your waistband is interfaced, it will be really stable, and it just is always like this if you're pinning something floaty to something more stable. So pin as much or as little as you want. You do you, basically. Sewing is all about finding your own ways to do things that suit you and that you get enjoyment from. I don't think it should ever be a big burden or should cause you anguish. So do it in a way that makes you happy. Some people, for example, don't even like pinning at all. And good for them. I am not one of those people. I quite like a good pin. Just makes me feel more comfortable in the machine. And so my pins have got a plastic head. They're really handy because they're quite big and easy to hold. But as they're plastic, if I'm not careful, they can melt under the iron. So things like glass head pins are really, really good. In general, kind of get the finest pins you can afford. I think the finer they go, the more expensive they are. But a fine pin will be lovely to work with. There we go. Coming to the end, which is good because I think I had run out of pin chat. So this is pinned on now. Got the waistband pinned onto the skirt. This part of the waistband folded out of the way. We don't want that to get caught at this stage, but we're going to move over to the sewing machine and we're going to sew these two together. Okay, so nice and easy, nice straight line, 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. And remember, you've got that little bit that is overlapping, so you've got 1.5 centimetres of waistband at the end of your skirt waist. Couldn't think of the word there. So it will poke out a little bit, but again, just back stitching, taking out your pins as you go. I'm sewing this from the waistband side, so it's really nice and easy and stable. But I'm also moving the fabric here as I go, just because if it all stays around here, you can see this kind of bunches round. Ideally, you want the fabric to be sitting outwards in the sort of situation that it's going to be in, the natural position of this seam, if that makes sense. So whilst to stop it kind of gathering up here, I'm just going to move this as it goes, not forward, not back, just out. Obviously the sewing machine's doing most of the work, but if I can help it, I will. I'm kind of like that. I think that's seam allowance. Oh no, that's pointing in the right direction. Keep your seam allowances pointed in the right direction. And sew all the way around there. So if you're new to our sew-alongs, you'll find a lot more on YouTube. So we've always done sew-alongs on YouTube. Just in varying different formats really. It's mostly been Lisa who used to own Sew Over It, and especially we did a lot of sew-alongs during the pandemic, because it was such a nice way to engage with people, to keep in touch, to keep everyone sewing. So you'll find a lot of sew-alongs from that period. Sometimes we don't have time to get all of the garment done, but if there's ever a bit that isn't shown, or like Lisa runs out of time, or it isn't clear enough, then you can always just email us, and we will always point you in the right direction, either over email or through a stitch school tutorial or something like that. So that is that seam sewn. So you've now got your skirt with your waistband attached, and we're just going to go ahead and press that as the next step. Let's get pressing. So we've got our seam allowance that we've just sewn. It's this bit here, and we're going to press it up towards the waistband. One thing you can do, if you're feeling kind of fancy, if you've got the time, sometimes I find I get a really nice neat seam if I press something open before pressing it up. So it's just a little extra you can do. I find pressing open definitely gives you a nicer look on the outside, but we don't want this seam allowance actually to be facing down. So, oh, and also trying not to iron out any other bits that you have previously ironed. So I press this bit open, and then once I've done that, I'm then going to press it up. If I'm pressing open, just makes that seam so crisp and satisfying. So you can do that all the way along the waistband, or you can just press straight up. Absolutely fine. Do what works for you. And yeah, try not to iron out completely the fold in the middle that we pressed before, and also this top fold. So you're trying to just iron that little section that you're working on. But go ahead and do all of that pressing, and then we are going to attach the ties. So I'm just pressing from the right side now. So my seam allowance is all pressed up towards the waistband, but I'm just doing another press from the right side to really kind of open up that seam, because I know it's going to help later on. I think that's a good point to always think you can have a read through the instructions, and when you get a bit more used to what things work in a certain way, you can think about, well, what's coming next? I know that what's coming next is that we're potentially going to stitch through this seam, and having it pressed really neatly open, or at least, sorry, the seam allowance is still going up towards the waistband, but really nice and flat, means that I'll get a nicer finish on my waistband. Right, I think that's done that. And you can also see that where the overlap is, I've also pressed that up to the same width. And just check this side. Oh, that's a little bit wonky. Let's fold that little layer out and give that a press. Okay, let's get our ties. So we're working from the right side. We've got the body of my skirt here and the waistband up here. And if I reach down, I have my ties and my instructions. Again, this is another sort of asymmetrical bit, so I always like to refer to the instructions again to make sure I'm doing it right. So we're going to lay the skirt out flat, like I have done. I might do it a little bit neater. And as always, from the right side, just going to give that another press. And throw all my stuff on the floor, there we go. And as always, from the right side, we've got this shorter waistband piece on the right hand side, and we are going to take the shorter, I'm reading this because I struggle with my left and right sometimes and I need to read things through, so don't worry if you do too. I'm gonna take the shorter tie and attach it on the right hand side, so it's shorter tie to shorter waistband piece. And what we're going to do is take our short tie. I'm going to put it so the seam is facing down towards the skirt, and I'm going to line it up on this lower part of the waistband here. So I've got the fold of the waistband there on this lower part, matching the raw edges. And I'm just going to pin that in place, just with 2 pins, like that. So that's the short tie and the short side of the waistband. So then we can move over to the other side and do the same. So it's the longer side of the waistband and the longer tie. But just to be consistent, I've got the seam on this tie facing down towards the skirt. Line those raw edges up on that lower part of the waistband. There we go, pin those in place, and then we can move over to the sewing machine and just anchor those in place for now. So we're going to sew these ties in place just within about 1 centimetre. So you've got 1.5 centimetres to play with. This is just a machine tack. It's just to secure it in place. It isn't the final bit of stitching. So about 1 centimetre is perfect. It just means that that'll stay in place when we're doing the next step. Just kind of to help us out more than anything else. The other side, where are you? There we are. Make sure you don't sew over your pins. I was very close there. And now, my machine is eating my fabric. It didn't like that at all. It just got caught on the edge. Right. See, it happens to the best of us. Just start a bit further in there. What we're now going to do is get rid of any of our threads, because we're good, and we're going to fold the waistband back on itself so it's right sides together, and we're just going to match those folded edges. We're not worrying about the rest, we're just talking about this edge, and we're going to make sure any seam allowance is still pointing up towards the waistband. And we're going to put a pin in there, like so. So inside there, we've got our tie that's sandwiched. Then our waistband is folded right sides together. And what we're going to do, obviously when you put on this waistband, you left 1.5 centimetres excess at the end. If you veered away from 1.5, this is the part of sewing which is great, because this doesn't really matter. So what you're going to do is, ideally you'll sew a 1.5 centimetre seam up here, but what you actually want to do, what you want the outcome to be, is a seam that is flush with the front edge of your skirt. So use that as your guide. If it's not 1.5 centimetres, don't sew it at 1.5 centimetres. Sew it so it is flush with the front edge of your skirt. And mine actually is a little generous. I'd say it's probably about 1.7 or something like that. But it's more important that it's flush with your skirt. And we do mention that within the instructions as well. At this stage, don't go immediately by seam allowance, go by getting that nice and neat and flush. You're sewing through all of those layers. And I will trim this properly and press it and everything, but just to show you how that works. So that is sewn in. We've got a sewn edge there. But if we turn it through and give our tie a little tug, you've then got a tie that is really neatly enclosed. So you want to just do that on the other side too, and then we'll talk about finishing the waistband. So I've done both ends now. I'm going to chop off my excess. I would recommend having a bin close by rather than chucking things on the floor like I am doing. But you know, whatever floats your boat. And then you can quite easily turn the waistband through. To the other side, and if you give a little tug on those ties, it brings out that corner really nicely and neatly. And then your next step is to decide what you want to do on the waistband. So you can do two things here. In the instructions, you are told to slip stitch it down, which you can 100% do. It gives you a really beautiful and soft finish. And what I'm going to show you now is how to top stitch it. Sometimes if a garment doesn't have any top stitching on, I love slip stitching because it kind of gives such a nice soft finish. But for speed, if something already has top stitching on, which this skirt does, then I'm happy to do top stitching because then it just matches everything else. So the sensible way to do this is to have your waistband wrong side, so the wrong side of the skirt is facing you, and fold that waistband so the folded edge is sitting just over your original line of stitching. And because you've pre-pressed this, it actually should be really nice and easy. That is the joy of pressing it before sewing it on. It might seem a bit weird, but you've kind of done the job already. You just want to make sure that seam allowance stays pointing upwards. And you kind of want it to overlap that line of stitching a little bit, because we're going to be sewing from the right side to make sure our top stitching is beautiful. You need to know for sure that your underside is getting caught. So you can go ahead and pin along the wrong side like that. And once you're happy with that position, flip over to the right side. What I tend to do is just hold it quite firmly where a pin is, take that pin out, my fingers are then holding it really, really firmly there, and pop that pin in. And all it means is that the position of the fabric hasn't changed, but I have moved the pin. And now I'm thinking about it, I'm going to want to sew in this direction, so I want my pins to be facing the other way, which is what we did before. It's changing the direction. Always have a little think about what direction you're sewing. So either way, whether you're machine sewing or you're slip stitching, you will want to pin your waistband. So go ahead and do that. And if you want to machine stitch, come join me on the sewing machine. If you want to slip stitch, go put something lovely on the radio, put some rubbish on the telly and sit down and slip stitch instead. And we'll get our waistband sewn up, and then we're so close. All of a sudden we'll have a very nearly finished skirt. Okay, we've moved from waistband town to top stitching town. If there were such a place, I think it might be my favourite place to live, because top stitching is the best. Anyway, as I said, you can slip stitch this down if you want to. This is how you top stitch it. So you've got your seam that you pressed beautifully previously. Got these really long ties that need to get out of the way. There we go. And I'm gonna pop this under my foot and find a really nice place to line up with. So for me, I think that's going to be the inside of my sewing machine foot. I'm going to line up the seam with the inside of my sewing machine foot, and then I'm going to move my needle quite far over. So that is, I'm going to say between 1 and 2 millimeters, probably 1 millimeter away from the seam, which sounds like a teeny tiny amount, but actually that is a nice amount of space. It looks like a pretty distance. It looks visually nice, and I know it's definitely going to catch that waistband underneath. So the other thing I need to do is put my stitch length up to 3, because that's what my top stitching has been before. So this is on the waistband, not on the ties. I'm just going to back stitch a little bit. It's a little bit bulky here, so my machine does need a little help there because there's a lot of layers. And then I might just have to give it just a little tug. Oh yeah, definitely, to get it over that bit. There we go. There's no harm in helping it. And then take your pins out as you go. But the main thing is just nice and steady, lining up with that seam. It might seem like your waistband is sort of fighting a little bit, but remember, everything like that can be resolved with a lovely press at the end. Focus on the bit where you are at the moment for now. So you want to sew this top stitching down or your slip stitching down, and then go and give it a press if you need to afterwards. And then we'll sort out what I think is the last bit of our skirt. Okay, so we're on the last step, step 24, if you're following the same instructions as me. Oh no, wait, step 23. So we are going to be looking at that little gap we left in the waistband. So you can see my top stitching now. I'm quite pleased with that. It looks really lovely and neat. At this gap in the waistband, you can probably see that you've got some seam allowances in there. So the first thing we want to do is trim them down, just the bits that are visible really. I'm using these little snippers because they're quite sharp, well, they're very sharp, but they're easier to do these little bits without, rather than big scissors. And just trim it down as best you can. Don't worry a huge amount, because this is going to have a tie pass through it, and it's at the side of your waist, and it's not going to be overly visible, but sort of just chip away at it until you're happy that there's not much on show there. And we can actually do a little bit more trimming in a little while as well to get rid of those threads. So I'd say do it until you've kind of got rid of the bulk of anything obvious there, so it looks like a proper gap. And then I'm just going to pop a pin in. I might choose to remove that later, but just securing those two waistband pieces together. And what we're going to do is edge stitch around that gap so that that is nice and secure, and it creates a nice little gap for our tie to go through, and it also adds a little bit more stability to this top edge, which looks very small at the moment, but once we put that edge stitching on, it will be a lot more secure. So back on the sewing machine for the last time in this project, and the last time before you can dance outside in your brand new skirt. Let's see, where are we? There he is. So I'm going to go down to I think I'm going to go a bit smaller. I'm going to go around 2.2. I'm going the wrong way. This is all about security, and it is all about making this area really strong. It's a more functional piece of sewing than it is a pretty piece of sewing. So edge stitching is a bit like top stitching. We're just going to go quite close to the edge, so find the place you're going to line up with. I'm actually going to start edge stitching about halfway down that opening, because it just feels a bit easier than starting right at the top. So I've lined up with the inside of my foot again. I'm going to move my needle across again until I'm yeah, about 1mm away from that open edge. Because I'm going to come back round to where I've started, I'm not actually going to back stitch right now. I am just going to go in. So going straight down until I'm about 1mm away from the edge of the waistband. For me, that's where my top stitching is. I'm going to pivot, go across. It'll probably be 2 stitches, maybe 3 stitches, she says, maybe 4. There we go, maybe 4. But I just use the hand wheel there just to get a bit more control. And then up the other side. Slow and steady for this one. Again, until you're about 1mm or 2 away from the top edge. Pivot again. I have to get my pins out of the way. So you're sewing along the top edge. Again, hand wheel if you need to. The stitches with the hand wheel are just as strong. And then back down to where I started, and I am going to do a little back stitch there. And there we go. All you've got to do is cut off any rogue threads. Because this is really nice and secure in that little opening on the waistband, you can trim away at any excess fabric and get that super, super neat. It is actually almost a little bit easier to do that after you've sewn those stitches, because things aren't going to wiggle out of the way. But then, just to show you how it all works, you will have a skirt with a long tie that comes through. This is like your overlap, feeds through that little hole in your waistband, like so, and then you will have a skirt like this. This one can come round and tie on that side, and then you've got a great easy skirt that you've just made that is really easy to fit, really easy to sew, and looks so different in a million different fabrics. I think, like I mentioned, I have got, well, with this one, I'm going to say this is number 5, and they're so wearable and they work so well with lots of different fabrics, lots of different prints, lots of different tops, and can give quite a different look depending on what you make out of them. So I really hope you enjoyed sewing up your wrap skirt. If you are following on in our beginners guide to sewing ebook, then obviously move on to the pajamas next. That's also another lovely sew that you can get completely indulgent in fabric choices with, because they're pajamas. If you want to look for more sew alongs on our YouTube channel, please do. There's plenty on there, and there's also a myriad of resources on Stitch School as well. Have a look over there, check that out. If it's your sort of thing, then a subscription to Stitch School is really good value for the amount of content that's on there, and we're adding things every single month. But otherwise, yeah, I really hope you enjoyed sewing up your wrap skirt. So if you have enjoyed, then please give us a like below. It really means a lot to us. Comment, tell me what you're making, what have you loved to make, how did you start sewing? Maybe if you're not a beginner, you're just watching this because you like having some sewing in the background, please tell me your sewing story, because I love them. But we don't just do sew alongs here at Sew Over It on YouTube. There is plenty more for you to be interested in too. We post videos about our team makes. We've got the whole team making different things. We have different styles, we've got different body shapes, we have different fitting queries, all of which we talk about in detail. We very recently got into historical sewing facts, especially me and Elma, and we love to have a chat about the history of certain features or certain ways of sewing, or the kind of more societal aspects of sewing as well. So have a little look for those. There's lots of fun to be had there, and you'll also find longer term projects as well, such as Jeans Club, where Alma and Chloe are documenting their entire process of making jeans. And we've also got another pattern coming up soon that we will be doing another club for, where the whole team will be detailing the process of making one pattern, and you can see all the differences and all the fitting things that we go through. But I really hope you enjoyed that. I really enjoyed thinking of you all sewing along with me, and I would love to see your wrap skirts out in the wild.